Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Eric Holsworth, Managing Director of Clean Energy and Environmental Policy at the Edison Electric Institute, or EEI. EEI is proud to be a sponsor of today's event where we're going to be talking about near and long-term opportunities and challenges regarding the clean energy transition and the important role that the electric power sector is and can play in not only reducing carbon emissions, in which we're leading the world, but also in scaling up the technologies we need to reach net zero, both today and in the future, and to ensure that all customers and all communities are benefiting from this clean energy transition and from the investments that are being made to accelerate clean energy development. Today's event is going to address the importance of public and private financing and funding for accelerating the development of these new low emitting technologies that are crucial for reaching net zero emissions. We're going to have featuring keynote remarks from the chair of the Ex-Im Bank, who I'll introduce in just a second. We're going to have followed that by a very esteemed CEO panel that'll be chaired by Brian Riley of Barclays. It's my pleasure now to introduce our keynote speaker. Rita Jo Lewis, the chair and president of the Ex-Im Bank, was sworn in by Vice President Kamala Harris in February of 2022. Ms. Lewis is a senior executive with over 25 years of leadership experience in international affairs, legal public policy, business and regulatory affairs, and subnational diplomacy. She was most recently a senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund, where she oversaw programs including bipartisan exchanges for members of Congress and her European counterparts. Ms. Lewis was also the first black woman to serve as vice president and counselor to the president of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, where she focused on strategic alliances between small businesses, especially women and minority-owned businesses. One of the things we want to talk about today is the important role of public and private financing, and I can't think of a better speaker to help kick that off than Chair Lewis. Chair Lewis, please take the stage. Thank you very much.
Eric, thank you so much. So excited to be able to be here for this conversation that EEI is kicking off today. I know so many of you have a lot of places to be, but the panel and I are very excited that you're here for a few minutes. You know, when I looked at this topic and you're talking about near and long-term opportunities, and you're really talking about the stakeholders that are going to be involved, and more importantly, how is public and private funding going to come to all these projects, I think that EEI has put together a great conversation today. And so for those of you who are not aware, we are excited at Ex-Im Bank to be here supporting clean and renewable energy projects around the world. As a transformative agency that has been supporting American businesses and workers for over 89 years, especially now under the Biden-Harris administration, we believe we are helping American businesses grow, create new job opportunities, strengthen infrastructure at home and globally, and ensure that our partners around the world have access to the resources, the financing resources they need to strengthen investments in their people. You know, Ex-Im was established as an independent federal agency as America's only official export credit agency back in 1934. You know, we have our offices in Washington, but we're also located around the U.S. in 12 regional offices nationwide. But more importantly, as you know, our mission is to support American jobs and companies through facilitating the exports of U.S. goods and services. You know, it has been important for us as a government agency to know that Ex-Im Bank has a history steeped in financing some of the world's most important projects. And so today, as we are out here for the next several days here, make sure not only as I look to meet you, I know our team at Ex-Im, we have Jesse, we have Craig, we have Hazine. Please raise your hand. These are our folks who are steeped in the knowledge of this and about the business of all things. I call it climate financing and renewable energy, energy storage, and energy efficiency. The thing that makes this, I think, important for Ex-Im as America's credit agency to be at this COP. Now, this is not my first COP. This is probably my 10th COP. So I know many of you probably have me beat. But for this agency to be here at this time allows us to do what Congress has asked us to do when we were reauthorized in 2019. They asked us to do 4 additional things as we look at financing companies of all sizes and in all sectors. They asked us to make more financing available in small business, and not just small business for small business sake, but women and underserved communities. They asked us to make more financing available in the transformational exports areas that ranges everything from semiconductors, AI, quantum computing, water, sanitation, critical minerals, and the like, especially where we are in competition. Our companies are in competition with China. And then they asked us to make more money, more financing available in sub-Saharan Africa, and to make more financing available in the renewable energy space and environmentally beneficial. You know, it comes as a perfect time for EXIM because the Biden-Harris administration, when the president went to meet with his colleagues 2 years ago at the G7, they agreed on an initiative called the Partnership for Global Investment. And in that, there were 4 pillars. And renewables comes right there in one of those main pillars. So at the end of the day, we are here offering to assist and help businesses with invaluable market intelligence as well as insights. And so when Congress reauthorized EXIM, they reauthorized us with a lending cap of about $135 billion. EXIM has authorized about $35 billion of that. So that means we have about another $100 billion to go. And I put that number out there because it just tells you why we're here. We are, at the end of the day, our prime purpose for being here is not only talking to all of you, but asking you to be the ambassadors that we need to bring us those bankable projects, to bring us the projects that we need to see that we will never know because there's just not enough of us. It's like 400 employees at EXIM Bank. I told you there's only 12 offices. But the most important thing is we continue to grow our pipeline, especially as it pertains to environmentally beneficial goods and services. We work very closely with our embassy team. And so right here, not only in the UAE, but with all the countries that are assembled here, we are very excited to work alongside our Department of Commerce, Secretary Raimondo and her team who are here. We're all over at the U.S. Center. Make sure you come and visit us. We're going to have a number of announcements that's going to be coming out from the U.S. government, and EXIM is going to be right there online with that. But the most important thing about working with the embassy team is that the foreign commercial services can be there to be your advocates. They are the ones who can bring those trade missions, work with those trade missions that are coming from foreign countries where the foreign buyers are looking for goods and services to purchase in the U.S., and working with TDA, with Eno Ibong, the director, as they are doing project preparation on so many reverse missions that they also entertain. We want you to know that during the last fiscal year, EXIM supported a total of more than $8.7 billion in transactions for large and small business. We have a long history of financing projects that are important to both the U.S. exporters and their international customers. We can provide direct loans, loan guarantees domestically and internationally, as well as export credit insurance and working capital guarantees to U.S. exporters. You know, we believe that the financing tools that we have at US EXIM can be a game changer for your companies to help them grow through exports by leveling the playing field so they can compete globally, minimizing the risk of buyer non-payment, and supplementing commercial financing with terms that will work to their advantage. You know, one of the things that is so important, I think, in the work that we've done in this administration is that we understand we cannot do this work alone. Over the last 2 years, we have re-upped or signed 20 co-financing agreements, many with our G7 partners, our Quad partners, members of the APEC region in the 21 economies, as well as our friends and allies who are part of the G20. And so for us, One of the things that people ask us all the time is, are we open and where are we open at? We tell you, and you never like to let people say go to the website, but you got to go to the website. It's called xm.gov. All you got to do is punch it in. You want to find out about the country limitation schedule. It will tell you exactly where we are open, where we are closed, and it will tell you public, private sector, and the years of where the potential projects in the public and private sector that you might be interested in to have financing, and it's right there at xm.gov. Over the last fiscal year, we have authorized over $1 billion in financing to support environmentally beneficial goods and services exports, which constitutes about 12.1% of the total 8.7 in authorizations. This also includes, and we're happy to be here to shout this from the rafters, that it includes the largest renewable energy project ever supported by the U.S. government at Exim Bank. It was a $907.5 million long-term loan for a solar energy project in Angola. So I'm sure many of you may have seen that the president of Angola just recently left his meeting in the Oval Office with President Biden, where the president was also touting that particular, we believe, game-changer transaction. It's going to be a project, definitely, that aligns with Exim's commitment to financing environmentally beneficial projects and renewable energy projects, as well as President Biden's partnership for global infrastructure. You know, the thing that is so, we believe, exciting and transformative about that particular transaction is that the solar energy project is going to generate over 500 megawatts of renewable power. It's going to provide access to clean energy resources across Angola. It's going to help Angola meet its climate commitments and support exports of U.S. solar panel mounting systems, connectors, switches, sensors, and other equipment, all while doing one thing that's important for us as an agency, supporting over 1,600 jobs in the United States. So for us, there's one other area of financing that I want to bring to your attention before I come close to my seat and to have this great panel come up. It's a project proposal that came to us out of the president's review of the supply chain. You know, as part of his commitment to bolster the supply chain and rebuild and revitalize U.S. manufacturing, Exim has also developed something that your companies might be interested in. We have developed an initiative called Make More in America, or MMIA, as we like to call it. You know, we're a government agency. We're nothing if we don't have an acronym. But the bottom line about Make More in America, the president has definitely said in the State of the Union this year that we have to make more in America, but we also want to export more from America. So, well, on November 16th, under the MMIA initiative, we authorized also our largest MMIA deal, which was a $169 million loan to Beta, BETA, to finance its state-of-the-art net zero final assembly facility, which is also going to support 400 good-paying jobs. The thing that in Vermont, the thing that we like about MMIA is that it is the first time that a U.S. government agency has the ability to work with domestic manufacturers who are trying to grow and expand their work in the U.S. We just have 3 requirements. It must have an export nexus over the life of the loan. We must be additional to the transaction. It must create jobs. And of course, we must have a reasonable assurance of repayment. You know, we are the government, you all the taxpayers. We want to make sure you get your money back. But we believe that the Make More in America initiative can play a key role in supporting environmentally beneficial projects as well. And so that's why we're so excited to be here alongside our colleagues at the USG. We're very excited to be with all of you from the private sector and the public sector. We know that one government agency, one nonprofit, one private company is not going to be able to do the massive amount of work that we're going to need. And so with that, we just want to say thank you for giving us an opportunity to be here, to tell you a little bit about the work that we're doing, and to ask you to be the ambassadors that we need as you you, as an American company, a nonprofit, a private sector entity, is doing work with your foreign buyers here, looking at projects all around the globe to make sure that you think XM when you're looking for financing. Thank you so much.
Thanks again, Chair Lewis, for those really inspiring remarks. And what a great way to kick this off by talking about a key part of the public side of public and private financing. The Edison Electric Institute is a trade association that represents investor-owned or privately held electric companies. And we're very honored to have 3 of our CEOs attending the COP. It's our largest CEO delegation ever. And you're going to hear from them in just a minute in a really exciting panel discussion that we have coming up. I'm going to introduce the panelists and ask them to come to the stage. The moderator of our session is Brian Riley, Global Co-Head of Sustainable and Impact Banking at Barclays. Brian's going to be joined by our 3 CEOs and Arshad Mansour, President and CEO of EPRI. Our 3 CEOs are Pedro Pizarro, President and CEO, Edison International and EEI Chair, Rebecca Kiawa, President and CEO, NextEra Energy Resources, and Andres Gluski, President and CEO of AES. Please join me in welcoming them up to the stage.
Thank you, Eric. Chair Lewis, there is someone in the room that has you beat in terms of the number of COPs. Eric told me this is his 26th. That's very impressive. Anyway, it is my real pleasure to be moderating this panel, and we don't have a lot of time, so let's dive right in. Eric mentioned at the outset that the broad question that we are addressing in this panel is how can we ensure a global clean energy transition, and I want to underscore the word global. So I want to start with the big picture, and it's a 2-part question for each of you. And the first part is, from your perspective, what really is the role of the electric utility in the energy transition, and what are the largest, second part of the question, what are the largest challenges that you're seeing in your company playing that role? Pedro, you want to start?
Thanks very much for having us here and for moderating us. When you think about the energy transition, let's start with what this is all about. It's about addressing climate change, about decarbonizing the economy. And the study after study has shown that the most affordable and reliable way to get there is by using clean energy, clean electricity to electrify a lot of the economy. And so that's the objective here. The role of electric power companies, like our fellow EEI members, is really critical and core to that, and it spans the entire value chain. Many of our companies are deep into the generation space. You'll hear from Rebecca and from Andres, both of whose companies are very heavy there. It's also the grid operators like Southern California Edison, our utility, that are engaged in moving that power around. And importantly, it's what we also do with our customers to help them adopt technologies. And so as you think about this, we've done analysis at our company looking at the California example. It looks a lot like analysis that Arshad and EPRI have done at a national level. But we see needing significant additions of renewable energy along with storage to balance the intermittency over a strong, robust grid to then use electric vehicles, use building electrification, other electric technologies. Not everything will lend itself to electrification, and so we'll need clean fuels like clean hydrogen. We'll need carbon capture. And so I think from a challenge perspective, accessing all of those technologies, making sure there's sufficient R&D funding and activity going there, but importantly, working with government to make sure that we can deploy that infrastructure. And I'll close by saying siting and permitting, because if I had a magic wand, I said this to my colleagues earlier, but if I had a magic wand to fix one thing, it would be opening up the ability to take the dollars from IRA, take the dollars from IIJA, and actually put them in the ground. We need help in streamlining processes to be able to do that.
Rebecca, you want to comment? I assume you're going to talk about siting and permitting as well as the issues.
Double down on siting and permitting for sure. Yeah. I couldn't be more enthusiastic in endorsing that comment from Pedro. But in addition to that, as we are here at COP28 and did the global stock take, there's certainly a little bit of optimism that we've bent the curve in terms of emissions. But if you dive into that and see where the progress has been made, and particularly here in the U.S., it's all in the electric sector. As we've gotten more efficient, we've gotten more generation out of the existing assets, and of course, as we've deployed significant amount of renewable energy. We literally have made no progress in every other sector, and certainly not many meaningful progress. So I think the first opportunity is to be able to do what Pedro highlighted, which is continue to deploy renewable energy to decarbonize the rest of the electric sector. It is also to enable that decarbonized electric infrastructure to be able to source of energy to support other industries' decarbonization. The second area, and I'm so grateful that Chair Lewis was here, second area is clearly around global supply chains. As you look at the infrastructure that we all need to buy in any part of the decarbonization supply chain, a significant amount of that today is produced outside of the United States, and in many cases highly concentrated in very few countries, including one of the ones that Chair Lewis highlighted that we wanted to continue to diversify away from so that we have the resilience and the reliability in our supply chains to be able to deliver on this decarbonization. So there's a significant amount of work that needs to be done in both of those, and a great reason for us to be here at COP28.
Andres?
Sure. Let me take a little different, because I agree 100% with what my colleague said. But AES is a global company. So we're in markets abroad. So taking the question, what can the sort of U.S. utilities do to accelerate that? So one of the things that we've done is when we, basically we're an accelerator for new technologies. So we partner or develop small companies, and then having a much larger platform can grow them very big. But we've really found that the working internationally can actually be big help. So for example, the first, say, commercially viable grid-scale lithium-ion battery storage project was actually in Chile. We developed drone applications in Brazil and actually then brought them to the States, because it's kind of what Pedro was saying, it has to do with regulations. And not always all the states in the States have the easiest regulations. Yeah. So what we found, the States is really where the most creative stuff is happening on new technologies for carbon emission reductions. But then how do you take that to the export markets? So what we've done is like spin-off companies, like batteries. It's now in 30 countries. It's in terms of selling battery systems, it's fighting first place with Tesla. But we have 3 or 4 more other things coming online. So one of the things that the EXIM can help is really not all that may be made in the States, but with the IRA, you're going to have much better supply chain coming from the States. So I think that's going to be a game changer. But lastly, building a little bit on what Rebecca was saying, what I see, if you add up what the globe needs, there's not enough stuff. Yeah. There's not enough copper, there's not enough lithium. So what does that mean? That means, well, I think we have to deploy as soon as possible, right now, because climate change is happening in our sector. The greatest difficulties have been climate change related in the last 5 years. This is not tomorrow, it's today. But it also means to hit the sort of net zero by 2050, we can't get there by more of the same. We're going to have material breakthroughs. We're going to have to deploy smarter systems. And we're going to have to deploy them in a global scale. So the States has an interesting role to play there. And it's not just, again, some of these may be what the U.S. is exporting is actually systems and know-how. But I'm very excited about the amount of domestic manufacturing we're seeing come back to the States. It's for the first time, certainly in my professional life, that I see that.
Arshad, I want to ask you this question a little bit differently, because we just heard a common theme here, and that you can't get there. You can't get there by more of the same, right? So you're CEO of what effectively is the R&D engine of the electric utility industry. What technologies do you think are showing the most promise, right? We've had solar, we've had wind. That's gotten us part of the way there. What's going to get us the rest of the way there?
Well, make sure it's just first about the global. So we work in 45 countries with 450 energy companies. So optionality cannot be optional. That's our first thing. In some areas, renewables will work great. In some areas, you have to look into other technologies. So take a look at U.S. example. Today, almost 65% of our energy generation that we call dispatchable is coal and gas. That's 65%. And that's what is balancing the variable generation. So how do we bring a lot more renewables? Because our estimate is by 2030, we will have 600 to 650 gigawatt of renewables in U.S. Today we have 220. How do we bring that in and make sure do that in a de-risked way so we can use the renewables when the sun is shining and the wind is blowing. So the biggest technology opportunity in the near term is long duration energy storage. Because we're using lithium ion now, US will have most likely 100 gigawatt of 2 to 4 hours, maybe 6 hours. But long duration energy storage in the near term, and I would say we should keep our eyes wide open on SMR and advanced nuclear and carbon capture, utilization, and storage. If we cannot solve that, 80% of world's energy was fossil fuel 25 years ago. 80% of world's energy today is fossil fuel. And if you want to do net zero economy-wide, carbon capture has to be a technology, but that's further down the road.
Everyone agree around SMR being important?
Yeah, I would, but it's a little bit more, more in the future.
Yeah.
The one thing, I agree with everything he said, but I would add one thing, is transmission. Because the fact is that the wonderful thing about the States is the continent.
Yeah.
So you have, southwest, you have tremendous solar resources. You need to get it, to other places. So if you have wind from other places, so you can balance that. Europe's a good case where you have the wind in the north, sun in the south. If you had sufficient transmission, it would really help you on those shoulders. So, and it's actually, they work seasonally as well.
Maybe the other thing I would add is that it is going to take a whole slew of technologies, right?
Yeah.
And Arshad's right. The reality is today we have most of the energy coming from fossil fuel globally. In the United States, we still have some coal. You see a lot of transition in that. By the way, when you think about the pace of the transition to date, it's been remarkable. I think about our member companies at EEI. The emissions from our part of the sector are the same today as they were in 1984. But the energy production is 73% higher, right? So think about the transformation, and that's meant moving away from coal into increasingly natural gas and getting the next transition into wind and solar, et cetera. But as we do the analysis for California, for example, which world's fifth largest economy, so it's pretty instructive. As we look at 2045, we see a world where it's going to be mostly renewables and storage. We'll still need a little bit of fossil fuel in there with carbon capture, but importantly, about 15% of the generation we estimate is going to be coming from technologies that are really not mature today. So it is, and I'd add long duration storage to that. It's coming to the fore, but that'll be important. Offshore wind, particularly floating offshore wind, which is more of a challenge. You've seen a few demonstrations globally, but California will need a lot of that. Next generation geothermal, SMRs, they could be part of the equation. So the point is, it's not only any one silver bullet here. It's going to be a whole range of technologies that will vary probably from market to market.
You want to go? Sure.
All right, well, I'll pile on. A quick thing on technology. If you just take a quick stock take, if you will, in terms of the technological innovation, if you just look back a year and a half ago, I bet none of us, actually Google is here and Microsoft is here, so everybody but Google and Microsoft, we're not talking about generative AI. And if you talk about 15 years ago, none of us probably had iPads. And only a couple years before that, none of us had iPhones. So the technological innovation that EPRI is doing in terms of monitoring, developing, and advancing those technologies is critically important. And then I would characterize storage. I wholly support that one of the key things for us to decarbonize just the electric sector, much less be able to realize the contributions that we have to other sectors, is storage in all sorts of forms, including potentially in the form of green hydrogen to convey it into other technologies. But I think we're scratching the surface at what's possible. And if there's one thing that I'm excited about, there's a lot of things I'm excited about, but if there's one thing around the Inflation Reduction Act and the long-term visibility of incentives, long-term visibility into the deployment of technologies that can help to support decarbonization, it is that it brought along a significant amount of research and development dollars to bring about those innovations, accelerate them, and bring them to commercialization.
Great. Pedro, you mentioned customers before. Sometimes we forget that you all have customers.
We don't.
We don't.
Yeah, I know you don't. Yeah.
Well, we both jumped out of it.
Talk about what's about we the other day. Talk about engagement with customers. What do they want? And are they, your commercial and industrial customers, are they willing to pay up for cleaner energy? You want to start?
I
Pedro?
think that's absolute yes. And from an Edison perspective, we have two lenses into that. One is we see what customers are doing in Southern California with our SCE utility, but globally we're seeing this through Edison Energy, providing advisory services to large corporates across North America, Europe, and nice global footprint to that. What we're seeing is that, particularly on the corporate side, companies are committed to this, and it's for multiple reasons. There's a sustainability angle, certainly. There's economics, because a lot of technologies are maturing to a point where they are valuable. And I'll give you one example. Storage has come down significantly in cost. In some ways, it's still expensive, right, by some metrics. On the other hand, if you are a large corporate in, pick a state, and you have a high peak demand, and you can add batteries at today's cost to shave that peak demand and avoid peak demand charges from the local utility, that's an economic project, right? There's reliability and resiliency reasons that corporates are pursuing. So I think the answer is definitely yes. They're willing to pay for it, and it's not always paying more. Let me just touch on a broader set of customers, and as you go down into or across to the residential side, one important message that we have as an industry and that we certainly have as a company is that this transition needs to be equitable. It needs to bring everybody along. And so that's why it is exciting to see features in the IRA, for example, like the $4,000 used electric vehicle tax credit, something that we actually pushed pretty hard because we had that as a template from a California program. But making sure that our low-income customers, our customers in disadvantaged communities can be part of the transition, can access the electric vehicles, can access the heat pumps, right, that are going to be so critical to electrifying buildings. That has to be a core part of the story, and I'm really pleased that my colleagues across EEI are very committed to that.
Andres.
I'd like to sort of build on the point that he was talking about, sort of equity. I think what's very interesting and perhaps lacking a little bit in this discussion here at COP is really the role of innovation to help the developing countries and help the people who are most exposed. So if you think of something like telecom, I used to work in telephone before I got into the electric sector. And what mobile cellular did to impoverished communities, for example, in Africa or in Latin America. And it really wasn't like huge grants coming from the developed world. It was making the technology available to local entrepreneurs who then used it in all sorts of ways people had not imagined. So I think that, some of the new technologies we're coming up with can really help places in Africa, for example, to leapfrog. They don't have to rebuild the networks we have. And they also have different customer and industrial needs. But what I do think that the developed world can really do is help massify, move down the learning curve of these new technologies and make them available to them. And that, if it sort of follows a similar learning curve to telecoms, will create much more value and GDP than the outright grants of some kind. Not saying that they're not necessary, by the way. Yeah. All I'm saying is that this should be something in addition that we should be focusing on, is really sharing those technologies.
Rebecca and Arshad, I want a little bit of a different take on that demand question. I think you mentioned AI earlier, right? And what that is doing to the demand for data centers and the explosion in load growth. How do we continue down the path of the energy transition when I think, you guys tell me, but the growth of base load growth is much higher than GDP growth, perhaps in, I don't know how long. You tell me, 25, 30 years, maybe even longer.
Well, first thing, this is the AI race started for the masses in November of last year. Yeah. That's when, ChatGPT came out.
Right.
The race for data centers started right after that. Yeah. So give you an example in U.S., over the last 20 years, electricity demand in U.S. has gone up by 10%. 20 years, electricity demand overall has gone up 10%. In PJM, New England ISOs, SPP, all over the region, we are seeing that growth in the next 3 years to 4 years. So there is a 4x growth. To give you another data point, for 30 years, U.S. industrial electricity demand has been flat and declining. for obvious reasons. First time we're seeing a growth. So you have a near-term opportunity for economic growth, but a challenge on what resources needs to still stay online. And I think that will be the next defining 5 years.
I couldn't agree more. And I think that one of the notable points you just made is how quickly it changed. If you had talked to a number of utility CEOs a year ago, I don't know that they would have told you that their load growth is much different than what it had been for the last 5 or 10 years before. And on average, going from 0 to 0.5% per year to now mid-single digits in an extremely short amount of time, which is a real challenge to this industry. As you all probably well know from an economic perspective, utilities are very much incentivized to connect new load and enable them to use more electricity. And the things that we're hearing from a number of our data center customers is they are not able to connect to their local utilities fast enough. There isn't enough capacity. There's not, in some cases, literally enough equipment to be able to connect them as fast as the data centers want to be connected. And that's a real challenge for us as an industry, an opportunity in many respects to accelerate the clean energy transformation, because this is a great time to bring on more clean energy, and particularly in renewables. But it is also a real calling card for a number of the SMR technologies, other new solutions that can help solve these challenges in a way. I think that's one of the single biggest drivers for why a number of organizations are looking at SMRs, is both data center support and also clean heat, which when you look at decarbonization, one of the hardest things to do is replace efficiently, cost-effectively heat composition, which is one of the reasons why we're paying attention to SMR technology, although we would caveat, as I'm sure many of us in the industry would, that it's quite a number of years off before you reach true commercialization.
Other of you guys want to comment on?
Maybe I'll add that second what you said, Rebecca, in terms of the view a year and a half ago. And it's been data centers, but it's also been electrification, right? In California, we're seeing a little less of the incremental growth in data centers. We're certainly seeing it. But for us, it's been the much more rapid deployment of electric vehicles than we had expected previously. As you look forward, though, one other thing I want to put front and center here is the need for grid additions to interconnect all of this. Because whether it ends up being an SMR or offshore wind or more renewables and long duration storage, you're going to need the grid to move it around. In our analysis of how California gets to its net zero implementation by 2045, one of the insights that popped out from the analysis was that the rate of transmission wire additions over the next couple of decades will need to be at a pace that's 4 times the pace that we've seen historically. The rate of distribution wire additions is going to have to be at a pace that's 10 times the rate that we've seen historically. And so think about what that means in terms of supply chain, labor force. But again, going back to where we started, and you can pile on again here, Rebecca, but deciding and permitting to get all that investment done.
Yeah, I just, to talk about this, about half of my new customers in renewables are data centers. So I have a backlog of about 13 gigawatts. Half of that is in data centers. But what I'd say is that, sort of piling on, we also have to think of better ways to use our transmission. So for example, dynamic line rating. And we have some big projects in dynamic line rating. There's another one that is actually being used by Fluence, which is one of our spin-offs in Germany, is using batteries to base load transmission lines. Because transmission lines are underutilized. They're not used at 100% of capacity. So you have the opportunity for like an Airbnb of transmission lines. You put batteries between the where the renewables are being produced, you store them up, use the existing transmission lines when available, store them up at the other end, and give it to the client when he needs it. So this particular project is a reality being built today, is a $1 billion project in Germany to bring North Sea wind down to Bavaria over existing data lines. Because if you think permitting new transmission line stuff in California, try Germany. So what I think is all of us have to really be thinking of these new creative solutions. And if it works great in California, maybe it's works great in Germany, maybe it'll work in California, to be able to address what you're saying. Because we're not going to build enough transmission lines. I mean, given the rate of permitting that we have, given the shortages of transport, eventually we'll get there. But, I'm talking about the next 5 years.
Well, just jump on that. There's a new term called grid enhancing technologies, GETS. And we got to look at, we heard permitting, and unfortunately, EPRI doesn't play in that permitting zone. But what can we do now? What's the bridge? The bridge is, if you look at generation, transmission, distribution, all the way to your distribution transformer, our utilization of the system is anywhere from 55 to 35%. So if we can utilize our system more as we are building new transmission and distribution lines, and that's really where grid enhancing technologies comes up. And one of the things that we are starting is the biggest challenge right now, which Pedro, you'll be there on Thursday, is how do we de-risk some of those technologies today? We got to get the operational experience from Germany, from Chile, from other places, so that we can de-risk those technologies and double down and triple down in the next 5 years. But it's a bridge. You still got to build a whole bunch of new lines. But as you're getting your permitting done, just take the utilization factor, move it up by 5%. That's huge.
Just because this is a weird industry. You really basically have to produce in real time. You have no buffer. So basically the problem is you have to build your transmission lines for the peak, whether it be 15 minutes or an hour. That's absurd. No other industry does that. So, you have to look at the technologies, whether it be energy storage or whether it be DLR, whether it be batteries. But that's so important because the amounts of capital we need are massive. Yes. And we have to get smarter and have smarter systems. And that's the only way we're going to do this until the other technologies come online.
I want to make sure there's some time for the audience to ask questions. But before we do that, we can't finish this without talking about the IRA. And Rebecca, I think you mentioned it earlier. So that was August of 22, that was roughly over a year. How's it going, right? I mean, it's, what are the one or two biggest issues that you're seeing in terms of, taking advantage of the IRA?
Yeah, I think as I highlighted in terms of a positive comment, having that long-term visibility and incentives truly is a game changer for our industry. As many of you know, in the U.S., policy incentives have typically had a 1 to 2, maybe 3-year life, and we're constantly in this view of, is it going to be extended or not? And so having long-term visibility for the manufacturers, the supply chain, labor, et cetera, to invest in the technologies that are needed in order to have a vibrant industry for decades to come was difficult to make. And IRA was a significant change in terms of that respect. However, on the much more negative side, during and since then, we've seen significant uncertainties in the supply chain, inflationary pressures, and of course, changes in our cost of capital across the board that have resulted in increases in renewable costs, whether it's your levelized cost of electricity or you think about it in terms of a contract price to our customers. And they've roughly doubled over the last couple of years. So that's a real challenge. So terrific that we have the IRA incentives. They are somewhat mitigating the other pressures that we see. Going back to a positive, renewables are still the least cost form of generation in most parts of the U.S. That's great, but I sure wish that they were even more affordable like they were before. The second point that I'd highlight is we are continuing to wait for interpretive guidance in a couple of key areas. Of course, some of the manufacturing domestic content incentives still need to be finalized, maybe not even until the middle of next year. And of course, we're still waiting on the interpretive guidance for the hydrogen production tax credit, among other things. We would love to see a very focused policy response in order to bring the cost down for things like green hydrogen so that we can spur adoption, drive manufacturing scale, drive down the experience curve so that ultimately we can see green hydrogen and derivative products be affordable. We are a long way from that. So supportive policy and demand signals are incredibly important.
Maybe I can add to that. I think you covered it really well, Rebecca. Two things. One, on the positive side, DOE has done a very nice job at taking the programs that are that they've packaged up and getting money out there, right? So that's been well done across a number of areas. Ones that have maybe required a little bit less of the interpretive guidance. On the more challenged side, we do continue to see political discussion around trying to bring back some of the IRA provisions. And so as an industry, we're very committed to working on Capitol Hill to make sure that legislators understand the value that the IRA is bringing across the country. And I think, not to be political about this, but there's been insightful analysis that shows that actually the majority of benefits are flowing to red states as opposed to blue states. And so that's where it's encouraging that, having the money get out there and start having an impact in those communities hopefully solidifies the base of support for maintaining the provisions intact.
There's no better
Maybe a
way,
number on
way to
IRA.
get through the politics than hearing from the utilities, right? I mean, it cuts right to the.
The IRA, you have to look at the numbers. And the numbers is without IRA, we were estimating certain emission reduction in the U.S. without IRA. With IRA, we'll double down. If it's done right, by 2035, we can 2x increase the acceleration. That's the good news. So what's the other side of the story? U.S. has committed 50% economy-wide reduction by 2030. That will require 4x. So done right, IRA could give us 2x than what we would have gotten. But we would need 4x to meet the 2030 goals.
Yeah, I would say with the IRA, from the government side, the lack of definitions, taking a bit of time, it has become very costly because something like an electrolyzer, you lose your slot and it has to come to the future. But I think there are things outside the IRA because it's not just, in general, it's very good. And I think the funding of the DOE for new technology is fantastic. We really needed that. And it's really provided certainty to move manufacturing to the U.S. But things like, for example, the Oxum tariff circumvention case. It was brought by a small manufacturer in the States saying that panels coming from Southeast Asia were basically Chinese, circumventing the tariff, et cetera. Well, in 2022, because of that one case brought by a 1% of the market supplier, we actually completed less solar in 22 than we did in 2020 in the U.S. So that, just tell you, so it's like the left hand and the right hand, they're slowing it down. What Pedro brought up, I'll say it less diplomatically, some of the talk about, scaling back the IRA is really defeating because basically the whole point of the IRA is that you have a 10-year window to have certainty to make 30-year investments. So if you have people saying, I'm going to reverse this, even though it's highly unlikely, because playing defense is much easier than playing offense, it's not helpful. So I think the IRA is much better than if you just measured it on the numbers, because there have been a number of outside factors that have made it less effective than it would be. So my only one criticism is what Rebecca had said, that some of these definitions coming out earlier would have saved a lot of money and a lot of time.
Questions from the audience? Anyone?
Thank you. Lawrence Jones with EEI. So earlier last week, I attended an event in Abu Dhabi where we had utility executives from across the region. And one of the things they talked about was about transmission, but one of the focus regarding turning promise into reality was the staggering amount of equipment, supply chain issues that was brought up. And so just wanted to hear from the panelists, how do we make sure that the idea of the promise is not met by unlocking the supply chain? I'll give you one example. The folks from Hitachi were there. They have over 54 HVDC in their backlog, and they're probably only positioned to deliver 5, right? And so what thought you have on how to make sure that the promises being made, we've heard a lot of promises here, match up with the reality to deliver, especially from the supply chain side?
I think that's a great question, and it's certainly a challenge that we've run into. We've, just as our company alone, have invested about $100 billion in U.S. electrical infrastructure over the last 10 years, but we want to invest $100 billion more in roughly the next 4, just as an order of magnitude. And if you just translate that to GSUs, which, the amount that we need in terms of step-up transformers is very different for the types of generation we've built over the last decade versus the type of transmission we want to build in the next 4 to 5 years. Just GSUs, if you look back not just 10 years, but 20 years, we want to buy as many GSUs in the next 4 years as we bought in the last 20. And that's just one piece of equipment, and unfortunately a very important one in order to bring these electrical infrastructure projects into the grid. So we've spent a lot of time in our supply chain, more than we ever have before, in terms of developing relationships, understanding what it takes, helping our suppliers debottleneck, striking longer-term relationships with more suppliers than we have before. But I think communicating across the supply chain, not just with the suppliers to us, but ensuring that we're speaking through to their supply chains is incredibly important. On HVDC, one of the biggest challenges we've heard from Hitachi and a whole bunch of other suppliers that would like to supply this market is the engineering depth of experience. They are short on engineering staff to be able to do the analysis and work that's required for these complex projects. So reaching into the universities, ensuring that we have long-term training is also something we as an industry really need to focus on.
Maybe I'll add to that, and I think you covered it really well. This is a place where, as you might know, Lawrence, EEI and then the broader industry community through the ESCC, Electricity Subsector Coordinating Council, have come, it's brought the industry together. It brought our procurement experts together. There's been called it, I think, a tiger team, but to deal with these issues. And one of the important things that we can do as an industry, and obviously making sure we're not running afoul of, anti-competitive rules and all of that, but having a collective demand signal that we can be communicating to the market out there. It's one point I'd make. Second point I make is we're asking about IRA earlier, but I want to make sure we're not forgetting about IIJA and importantly the CHIPS and Science Act, right? And so that ability to bring a lot of semiconductor manufacturing back to this country is a critical step in enhancing supply across a number of components. Maybe final thought is. As we think about supply chain, I also want to make sure that we're thinking about the security, not only availability, but the physical and cyber security of that supply chain. And so that's where, working with our partners globally, but also making sure we have enough domestic content and finding that right balance there. And frankly, also getting support from the federal government and intelligence around where might there be issues with supply coming from specific countries that may not be as friendly as we would like. And so how do we make sure that we're building, resiliency into the supply chain that we're getting, from outside of, domestic manufacturing?
Anybody else want to comment on that?
Sure, I would add that on the engineering side, I do think like within 5 years, AI will be helping to relieve some of those bottlenecks. But I think we must recognize there's some kind of a market distortion here. Because normally, if you're an industrialist and you have tremendous demand, you build more factories and you do it. So there must be something more than just the supply chain. I think there's a certain amount of uncertainty about how much of this can actually be built out, giving all the constraints, whether it be permitting, whether it be supply chains, that they're not doing this. So I do think that capital markets are kind of out of sync with what the world needs right now.
Yeah.
Because it's clear we have to triple renewable capacity from now to 2030 to make a dent in climate change, right? Yep. Normally, we have a lot of incipient new technologies.
Yep.
So normally you have sort of a euphoria that these new technologies get, overinvested in, and then you have when they get more mature, you have a weeding out. Well, starting because of interest rates, that was really the excuse, green has lost favor. You've gone from a green premium to a green discount. This makes no sense with the level of expansion we're in right now. So what I see is technologically and from a demand point of view, we're way on the upswing. Yeah. On the other hand, capital markets are on the downswing. Yep. And personally, I've never been in an industry that's this out of whack. Yeah. And that's this important. Now, that'll take a whole different seminar how to address this.
Yeah, we have a few more hours to talk about that.
Yeah, but it is something that we have to address because it's not normal if you had tremendous demand for electric cars. Well, then you build more factories. What is Tesla doing? What is Honda doing? So why aren't they doing it? I think some of these other factors.
Yeah, you mentioned SMR. There's not an investor out there that wants to touch SMR, right? Because it takes too long, right? Their funds aren't set up the right way. Are we out of time? So we are out of time. Thank you all. Thank you everyone for attending. Eric, really impressive effort putting together a panel like this. I know that's not easy, but to get to 4 speakers like this is a job well done. So thank you all of you for speaking.